the last several days, the Northwest has been impacted by a Pacific cyclone, which is not terribly common in this region, but can happen. And as you can see behind me here, Idaho got the fun aspect of this weather. But for my friend Jeff over in the Seattle area, life looked a little bit different, where they had localized disruptions in grid power and cell phone communication. So come on back inside with me and we'll talk about some of the simple steps you can take to prepare your communications plan for the next weather-related disruption. For a lot of you who have been watching my videos over these past several months as we've built an off-grid digital communication system, I think you'll find the contents of this video to be a little bit below your skill level. A lot of you are operating up here. You're amateur radio operators. You love the communication space. You enjoy troubleshooting challenging technical issues, but it's very easy for us to forget that most of the people in our hemisphere just aren't that interested in comms. A lot of people just want to pick up a cell phone or perhaps a walkie-talkie and maybe press a couple buttons and have it work. And that's okay. Everybody has different priorities. Everybody has different means. We are all starting off from a different place, and that's part of the beauty of humanity. We live in a society, in these communities, where we may be weak in an area, and our friend is strong in that area, and they can help us out. Similarly, perhaps we're a little bit stronger in the communication space, and we can share some of our knowledge with a friend who wants to shore up a weakness in their communications plan and in their overall preparedness strategy. So please consider passing this video along to that friend who just went through this Pacific cyclone event and wasn't able to communicate with family, or maybe their wife gave them that mandate where I just felt really uncomfortable and you better come up with a plan so that I don't feel that uncomfortable again. That's what this video is going to be for. Let's first get an overview of the scope of the issue. Here is a Verizon wireless outage map maintained by istheservicedown.com, and these are just user submitted outages that we see here on a map. And as you can see, it's not the entire Northwest without communications. It's not even an entire state. It's just little pockets of outages here and there throughout the West Coast. In fact, whatever's going on the East Coast right now, those folks have it way worse than we do. So we can count our blessings. But let's go ahead and zoom in on that Seattle area, and we can see there are just little pockets of outages. So conceivably, if we have a means of keeping our cell phone topped off and we have some sort of mobility, we can go outside of those areas and potentially hook up to another cell tower and still get messages out to friends and family, letting them know we're okay. In fact, that's how my buddy Jeff was able to send me pictures of the damage from his area. So let's cruise down the Northwest. We've got a little outage here in downtown Portland. We've got something out in Beaverton. And a little bit of weather came through California. I don't know how many of these outages were as a result of the Pacific cyclone, but we can see there's a good amount here in San Francisco area, down south of the Bay. And so, yeah, the geography we're talking about here is not so far that you couldn't drive out of that area to try to get to another cell tower that might get your messages out. So here, we don't have to be survivalists. We don't have to do anything crazy. We can just make sure we've got a means of keeping our cell phone topped off so we can still try to go somewhere where we can have communications. When setting up a communications plan, many people think of this in terms of PACE, and that stands for primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. I want to do away with those bottom two bullet points for right now. I want to keep things simple, and so we're going to focus on the primary and the alternate. And in this modern age, our primary means of communication is most likely our cell phones. So there's nothing wrong with that. Our cell phones work great most of the time, and as long as we've got an alternative means of charging them, be it a car charger or a battery bank, we could probably walk, ride our bikes, or drive outside of one of these impacted areas and still get a message out. But we don't always want to be relying on somebody else's cell phone network infrastructure. And so we should layer another alternative means of communication on top of that. And so I've picked out two options here. They're by no means the only two options, but two options for you to consider adding to your communications plan to help make your family stronger. Our first option we'll talk about today is the CB radio. CB stands for Citizen Band, and this is the old trucker style of radio that you've seen in all the movies. Now, CB has a collection of 40 channels that you can use here, and we are just going to be talking about simplex communication. That is walkie-talkie to walkie-talkie. We're not going to use repeaters or anything fancy. These are fairly low power, but these are ubiquitous. They're everywhere, and the technology has been around for so long that you're going to find this type of device in flea markets. You're going to find cheap devices online. There's just nothing to hate about CB radio. I love CB radio for its simplicity. There's just not much to it to go wrong. I just buy an appliance and it works. Now, all of these radios are going to be much larger, and that is because the wavelengths that CB runs off of are much longer, like 11 meters long. And so you can see this is a much longer antenna, and this thing is just a brick, but this thing is always going to work. It's going to work especially well if you've got a way to route the antenna. You can see this particular model just has a B and C connector for the antenna. It comes right off, and I can plug on a mag mount antenna that goes right on the top of my car, and then I can run the coax through the window and clip it right there. So if you want to get a CB radio, you don't need a license. There's no test you have to pass, and I know that's something that turns a lot of people away from the amateur radio stuff. They just don't want to put it into time to study for a test, and I totally get it. That's just not most people's jam. And so if you don't feel inclined to do that, you shouldn't be obligated to. Nobody should pressure you into doing that if you don't want to do it. So check out CB. It is something your kids can use. If you're from that Seattle-Tacoma area, you'll be surprised to learn that Sir Mix-a-Lot is an avid CB user. I believe his handle is the Prime Minister. It'd be fascinating. I'd love to hear a report back from somebody in the Seattle area if they actually hear him on there using the CB radio anymore. And that is one fun thing about CB that is actually mentioned on the FCC website about CB. You can pick your own handle, and you don't have to use your real name. You don't have to use any sort of call sign. You can just pick whatever you want and start talking. Now, our next tier for backup wireless communications is going to be the GMRS radio, or General Mobile Radio Service. And check out this little tiny thing. You can get them this small. And that's because the wavelengths are so much shorter than CB. So whereas CB, we had an 11-meter distance that it takes for an electron to make a full sine wave, and I'm oversimplifying a bit. But with GMRS, we have a series of channels in the UHF spectrum, so the frequencies are much shorter, maybe around 70 centimeters instead of 11 meters. So everything can be much smaller. Now, you are not stuck with something this small, although I really like this tiny little form factor. And you can get mobile units that go in your car that allow you to pump out like 50 watts. This little tiny unit is the Retevis RB19P, and I'll put a link in the show notes. I got this for my family. We've got several units, and it pumps out 3 watts, but this little thing is able to access repeaters. Now, what a repeater is, and instead of talking just walkie-talkie to walkie-talkie, you can do that with this. However, you can also program it to access repeaters. And what that is equipment that people maintain up on top of mountains, up on top of buildings, and so it hears your transmission, because you program it to talk to it, and then it retransmits that out over a much longer distance. And so you can really extend your range by using repeaters. Now, there are a couple more hoops you have to jump through to access GMRS, and I'm not going to be anybody's fun police, so if you're not going to follow exactly the law, whatever, that's on you. But if you want to follow the law, you need to get a license, and that doesn't require a test. The fact that you can get a GMRS license without having to pass any sort of test is really appealing to a lot of people. And if you're that person, if I'm talking to you and you do not feel like taking another test to get another license in your life, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. That's totally reasonable. There are alternatives for you here. So we can just do a search for how to get a GMRS license, and there are plenty of step-by-step guides. Here's one right here I found, and I'll put a link in the show notes. These will walk you through that convoluted federal application process, and if you just take your time and go through these step-by-step, you will be successful in getting this license. Maybe that's the test right there. Can you follow instructions enough to successfully navigate the federal licensure process? Now, once you get that license, you will have a license for $35 that lasts 10 years. That covers your entire family, not just you and your wife and kids, but also your extended family, like grannies and aunts and uncles and stuff. So after you get your license, it just takes a few days. You can come over here to mygmrs.com and start looking around your area, and when you find these repeaters, you just hover over them and it'll show you kind of the expected reach of it. So some of these are kind of small, some of them are a little bit bigger, like that one, that's pretty big. This one's huge. Look at that. That covers almost the entire area of Seattle. I don't know if it goes all the way down to Tacoma, but let's see, there's some here around Tacoma. But maybe you just so happen to be that upstanding citizen. Well, there's a really good one. That upstanding citizen who sets up your own repeater and puts in the time and effort into researching that. Let's check out Portland. There's a couple of them down here, I believe. That's a good one. Looks like Gresham covers like everything. Goodness sakes. And let's just cruise on down the West Coast just because we checked that out earlier. And we'll see what there is in that San Francisco area. And we already see there's a few of them right in there. And get right up on them. And we can see that's a little baby one. It's a daddy. Now, some of you in the know may have realized by now that I didn't exactly pick CB and GMRS at random. Now, these radio services will work just fine for building your family's backup communications plan, and you don't have to do anything more than that. However, you can also use these devices to join a much larger network of amateur radio operators. And what I'm talking about is the AmRRON Channel 3 project. Check out the link in the show notes. AmRRON stands for the American Redoubt Radio Operators Network. And these folks have built a nationwide communication system that transmits messages all the way from the national level with amateur radio HF operators down to the local level, and even to folks who are not amateur radio operators using CB and GMRS. There's additional services called MRRS and FRS, which you can look more into later. However, If you have your GMRS radio or your CB tuned to channel 3, check out their schedule on their website. You can participate in these on-air meetings, which they call nets. At a certain point, they will break and they'll start calling out to you over channel 3 on your CB or your GMRS radio, and you can respond and you can participate that way, and you can transmit information up the ladder and you can receive information down the ladder through this nationwide network they have built. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that I've given you something to think about today.